Welcome to the second class of this week. We are going to see the rest of the bones of the human skeleton, talk about teeth, and finally seeing the differences between the skeleton of an adult and a non-adult. So we are going to see the bones of the post-cranial skeleton. It is divided into two parts, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton is composed by the vertebras, sacrum, ribs, and sternum, and together they all form the vertebral column and the rib cage. And then the appendicular skeleton is formed by the bones of the limbs. Starting with the vertebral column, it is composed by 33 vertebras in an adult. From this, 24 are separate, or movable vertebras, and the others are variably fused within the bony pelvis, which is the sacrum and the coccyx. There are 3 types of movable vertebras, 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, and 5 lumbar. The cervical vertebras are in the neck, the thoracic in the thorax, and the lumbar are superior to the bony pelvis. And in these images, you can see the vertebral column in an anterior view and in a posterior view. When we look at a vertebra, it has the vertebral body, which is this part, and then the ventral arch, which is this part of the vertebra. The ventral arch has places for the articulation with other vertebrae. For example, in this image, here and here, this is a surface for the articulation of the superior vertebra. And then the vertebral hole, which is where the spinal cord passes. The cervical vertebrae are the smaller ones, being that the size of them increases until the lumbar ones. This happens because there is an increase in the supported weight. In these 3 images, you can see that the 3 types of vertebra. Here you have a cervical vertebra, a thoracic vertebra, and a lumbar vertebra, and you can see that the size of the body is clearly increasing. The first and the second vertebrae are different from the others. The first is called atlas, and the second is called axis. This one is the atlas, and this is the axis. The atlas is the first cervical vertebra that articulates with the skull in the foramen magnum. The cervical part of the column is the most flexible, allowing a lot of movement to the neck, and the less flexible zone is the thorax. It is in the thoracic vertebrae that the ribs articulate. So then we have the sacrum, which is this bone here. The sacrum consists in 5 fused vertebrae, and at the end of the sacrum articulates the coccyx. As you can see here, this little bone is the coccyx. The coccyx is highly variable with 4 to 5 fused vertebrae, and it is our vestige of a tail. The sternum is composed by 3 parts, the manubrium, this part, the body, which is this part here, and then the xiphoid process, which is this little part in here. The sternum constitutes the anterior zone of our thorax, as you can see here in this image, and it articulates with the ribs, which are here, and the clavicle in here. So now the ribs. There are usually 12 ribs in each side of the thorax, with a total of 24 ribs. The upper 7 ribs articulate directly with the sternum, so they are called true ribs. Ribs 8, 9, and 10 are not directly articulated with the sternum, so they are called false ribs. And the last 2 are called floating ribs because they only articulate with the vertebrae. So in this image you can see here a rib, and at this end this articulates with the vertebrae, so it's called vertebral end, and then this part, it's where it articulates with the sternum, so it's called the sternal end. Moving on to the appendicular skeleton, the first bone is the clavicle. The clavicle is located above the rib cage in here, as you can see in this image, and the shoulder girdle is composed by the clavicle and the scapula. The clavicle is this bone that has kind of an S shape. It has the sternal end, which is this part, that articulates with the sternum, and then the acromial end that articulates with the scapula. The scapula is a large flat triangular bone that articulates with the humerus and the clavicle. The humerus articulates in the glenoid fossa, which is here, and this means that this part of the scapula is lateral. And then the acromion, which is this zone here, is where the clavicle articulates. The humerus is the largest bone in the upper limb. This is a long bone, which means that it has two epiphyses, the proximal and the distal. So here is the proximal epiphysis of the humerus, and here is the distal epiphysis of the humerus. And in the middle, it is called the diaphysis. So this bone is the humerus. It has a head in the proximal end that articulates in the glenoid fossa. And in the distal end, we find the structure, the trochlea, that allows the articulation with the bones from the forearm. And so the forearm is composed by two long bones, the ulna and the radio. And here is the ulna and here is the radio. As you can see in the image, the radio has a lateral position and the ulna a medial position. In the proximal epiphysis of the ulna, in here, we see the trochlear notch that articulates with the distal end of the humerus. We also see the radial notch, this part here, which is where the radio articulates. And in the proximal epiphysis of the radio, we can see this part, that it is the head, and it is round, and it allows the rotation of the forearm. The ends can be divided into three parts: the carpals, these little bones in here, the metacarpals, these ones, and then the phalanges. There are 8 carpals: the capitate, hamate, pisiform, tricotrol, lunate, scaphoid, trapezium, and trapezoid. There are 5 metacarpals, and they are simply called by their number, for example, first or second metacarpal. And the first metacarpal belongs to the first finger, which is the thumb. And then there are 14 phalanges, and the phalanges can be divided into proximal, which are these ones, intermediate, these ones, and then the distal phalanges, these little ones. Moving on to the pelvis. So the cocci are a part of the bony pelvis with the sacrum and the coccyx. The cocci are formed by 3 parts: the ilium, which is this part, the ischium, this part here, and the pubis, which is this part. So at birth, these parts are all separated, but they fuse with growth. Some important parts of these bones to sexual and age estimation are the pubic symphysis in here, the iliac crest, the auricular surface in here, the greater sciatic notch, and the acetabular notch. The cocci articulates by the auricular surface with the sacrum and with the femur on the acetabular notch. In the leg, we find several bones. The femur is the longest, heaviest, and strongest bone in the human body, and it supports the body's weight during standing, walking, and running. In this image here, you can see its location in the leg. So the femur articulates with the hip bones by the head, and then there's the patellar surface in here, which is where the patella articulates, and the condyles that articulates with the fibula. And the patella is this little bone in here that only articulates with the femur, as you can see in this image here, and it protects the knee joint. So the tibia and the fibula are the other bones that forms the legs, and they are located here. The tibia has a medial position and the fibula a lateral position. So this one in here is the tibia, and this one is the fibula. The proximal epiphysis of the tibia, which is here, this zone, articulates with the femur and then here with the fibula. And both the tibia and the fibula articulate with the bones of the feet. So, and in this image here, you can see how they articulate with each other. And the last bones are the ones from the feet. The feet is also divided like the hand, but in the feet we have the tarsals and the metatarsals. In the feet we have 7 tarsals, the medial cuneiform, the intermediate cuneiform, and the lateral cuneiform, then the cuboid, navicular, talus, and calcaneus. There are also 5 metatarsals, and they are also called by the number of the finger. And this is the first finger of the tooth that is called halux. And then the phalanges follows the same orders as the ones in the hands. Now that we already saw all the bones of the skeleton, we can classify them based on their form. There are long bones where one dimension is bigger than the other two and is tubular. And these bones are found in the limbs, the feet and the hands, for example, the femur, the humerus, etc. The short bones are bones where the three dimensions are similar, like the carpals and tarsals. The flat bones have two very similar dimensions, and the third is very reduced. And these are the bones present in the skull. And lastly, there are the irregular bones. There are the ones from the spine, like the vertebras. When we talk about human osteology, it is also important to talk about human teeth. They are the most resistant part of the human skeleton to chemical and physical destruction. Consequently, they are overrepresented relatively to other parts of the skeleton in a lot of archaeological and paleontological material. The teeth can provide information on age at death, sex, health, diet, and evolutionary relationships of extant and extinct mammals, hominids included. An important thing to know about the anatomy of the teeth is that they are divided into the crown, which is this part, and then the root. The adult dentition is composed by approximately 32 teeth. We humans are heterodonts, which means that we have more than one type of teeth. So we have incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. All of these are divided into superior and then inferior. The superior teeth are attached to the maxilla and the inferior to the mandible. There are two types of incisors, the central and the lateral ones. And then there are also the canines, which is this one in here, and the premolars. The premolars are also divided into the first premolar and the second premolar. And lastly, the molars are divided into first, second, and third. The teeth are called by the type of the tooth, if they are superior or inferior, and if they are in the left or the right part of the body. In non-adults, they have deciduous teeth or milk teeth, that is the first dentition that is formed and erupt. These teeth are systematically shed and replaced by their counterparts in the permanent dentition throughout childhood and adolescence. This replacement of teeth is also very important to estimate the age at death of the non-adults. So in this image here, you can see the deciduous teeth that are erupted, which means that they are the ones that are above the mandible. And then you can see below them in here are the permanent teeth that will eventually replace the deciduous teeth. The skeleton of a non-adult individual is different from the skeleton of an adult. The non-adults have a lot more bones, and this happens because with growth of the skeleton, the bones fuse. We are going to see in more detail the growth of the skull and the long bones. At birth, the skull is formed by 45 separate elements and is large relative to other parts of the body. At birth, the skull has areas that aren't covered with bone, but with connective tissues. And these soft spots are called fontanelles. They are cartilage that eventually harden and turn to bone. And in this image here, these parts that are in gray, these are the parts that are the fontanelles. There are 6 fontanelles that correspond to the sutures that I talked about, and one in the middle of the frontal. Sometimes, in adult individuals, it is still possible to see the marks of this fontanelle, forming the metopic suture. And in this image here, you are seeing the frontal bone of an individual, of an adult skull, and you can see this line in here, this part, which is the metopic suture. Lastly, in this class, we are going to see the growth of the long bones. As I said earlier, the long bones are divided into the diaphysis and the epiphysis. The metaphysis are the ends of the diaphysis, and between the epiphysis and the metaphysis, during development, is a cartilaginous center known as the growth plate, which is here, this part, as you can see in this image. This growth plate is made from cartilage that grows away from the diaphysis and is replaced by bone. And this is the process by which the bone grows. So, in non-adults, the epiphyses are separate from the diaphysis and they only fuse when the growth stops. As you can see in here, you are seeing a femur, and this is only the diaphysis, and then you see here, here, and here the epiphysis. Each epiphysis has a different timeline to fuse, so this is an important information to estimate the age at death of the neonatals, but we will talk more about this in the next week. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you next week.